A talk about Aurelia. So what I'm going to talk about today is firstly what is Aurelia. So I think a few of you might know. If don't, that's fine. I'm going to explain a bit about that and Spark frameworks in general. And next I'm going to give some pointers why you would use Aurelia instead of a couple of million other options. And also explain why Aurelia is worth knowing, even though you're maybe not planning to use it in like your production systems, but just worth learning in general. Some things that makes it a good fit for .NET developers, especially. But I'm not going to talk about, for example, configuring Webpack. There's like 200-line configuration file that the CLI generates in Aurelia and probably all the other frameworks as well. So that's for another time. I'm not going to be complaining about NPM or hopefully not going to be debugging all the package problems that it might cause sometimes. Quickly about myself. So I work at Codify. So I'm mostly doing web, also desktop, and most of the time .NET development. I personally think that web is a good solution, maybe in some situations where someone else might not prefer web. And I like to think about optimizing the development cycle. So just think about the tools that you get from frameworks and IDEs that you use that makes your development easier and more efficient. But I'm not all the time on the cutting edge. I also like to draw some class diagrams in pen and paper when I'm designing, so it's not all bleeding edge. So starting with Aurelia. So really, if you have any questions at any point, just give me a shout. I'll answer them as we go. Something where Aurelia comes from. It started with Rob Eisenberg, the person who created a XAML framework called Caliburn and Caliburn Micro. The next thing he did was Durandal, a JavaScript framework, and that was based on Knockout, so it had a lot of dependencies on some of the other frameworks. He was already also in the Angular 2 team for a while, didn't like it, made his own instead. So in January 2015, Aurelia had its first public release. It was an alpha version. So it took about almost the full year for them to go to beta phase, which was really close to a production-ready framework. And then in July 2016, they released their first production-ready supported version of Aurelia. So it's a couple of years old. Then at Codify, we started experimenting with Aurelia in 2015, so really in the early phase, about the same time that we started experimenting with .NET Core. So we had a pilot project in 2015, and then 2016 we started several new projects and also started developing a template to make creating projects based on Aurelia easier. And in 2017, the template and Aurelia became the default option if you started new web projects. So desktop on the other side, and web moved towards Aurelia at that time. So single-page applications in general, that's kind of my view what that means and what it means for the framework to support building sparse. I think user experience, it means that there's a like rich interaction instead of just like static pages where you browse from one page to the other. And between your navigation, there's no browser loading a new page or anything, so it should be more immediate feedback for you. And it suits for the applications where you're kind of in doing something instead of maybe searching for one thing and then going to another page. So if you think about search engine optimization for CRM sites, something like that, it's probably not the best option, at least the first option to go for SPA framework in that case. So it's more for rich user interface applications. From the technology side of things, it's really heavily depending on the client and the browser. So it uses a lot of browser APIs, and all the loading, or most of the loading, happens in the background. So instead of user waiting for feedback when the browser goes for a new page, it just does things in the background and gives you immediately feedback that you're waiting for this to happen, or you can even work on your other thing while it's loading in the background. So that's the kind of things that makes SPA frameworks separate from just static traditional web pages. And Aurelia as a SPA framework. So it's kind of working as an interface between the application and the browser. So your application code is running on the side of Aurelia, and Aurelia helps you to interact with the browser. So, for example, compared to using the JavaScript DOM yourself, which is pretty verbose and sometimes difficult to understand, you can use Aurelia, which makes it easier to use those standard tools. So it's not really something else, it's just a simplified interface on top of the browser. And it also takes care of some of the differences between the browsers. Aurelia also provides a lot of features that browsers don't have, for example, for navigation. So as mentioned before about SPA frameworks, they don't really go to a new page and load that and wait for the page load, but you usually have the navigation happening inside the application. So the application is running all the time. So Aurelia provides that kind of navigation within the application. Also managing your components. There are a lot of features in browsers that allow you to build components, just web components or anything similar to that. But Aurelia again makes it easier, makes it compatible for browsers that don't necessarily support that, and also manages your application files so that you don't need to import your files into your web pages using the browser, which might be a bit difficult, especially older browsers, but it just manages your whole application, makes it easier. But that's quite similar to any framework, any SPA framework, especially like React does the same kind of things, maybe a bit differently, but does the same things. Angular, Vue, all of those work pretty similarly. So why would you choose Aurelia instead of some of the others? I think the number one thing is that it's really simple and unobtrusive. So if you think about your application code, you have your models and views and components. You just want to write your code logic and write your templates in HTML. And that doesn't really have anything to do with any frameworks. You just want your components to display, you want your services to run, and you want to be able to communicate between those. And you also want to communicate to the browser, send requests through the browser using the Fetch API, for example, and somehow interface with the DOM to get your components displayed. So how Aurelia does it, it just kind of works in the background. So you don't need to change your code to make it fit into the framework, but you just build it with like conventions that Aurelia allows you to use and also customize if you need. And when you're using those conventions, Aurelia just writes all the necessary additional code in the background, so your application works without it being like Aurelia code. So you're writing mostly JavaScript or TypeScript, and you don't see in your application that this is Aurelia. It's mostly just plain JavaScript that you write. So that makes it really easy to understand. So if you see an application written in Aurelia, if you know JavaScript, it's pretty easy to understand what's happening, because you don't need to understand all the templating and all the API calls for that specific framework. If you understand how JavaScript works, it's easy for you to understand the application. One thing it's quite useful, it makes easy to switch your framework to something else. So if you don't have your code built specifically for a framework, that means you can switch to another framework without changing much of your code. And that also works if you want to switch to no framework. So say the browsers improve so that you don't need to use specific APIs from the framework anymore, but you can just directly use the browser. Then you can just stop using Aurelia for that specific part, and your code will just work as it is. So it's a really nice option for the stable development of longer living applications where you don't want to try to keep up with the framework, but you just want your application code to be independent from your framework. I've got a small example from React. So this is just something I got from the React, one of the first examples they had on the front page. So here you can clearly see that this doesn't really make any sense outside React. It won't run if you don't have React loaded, and if you want to get that template out of there, you need to strip out a lot of code. I'll show some Aurelia examples later, but I think it's a good example to kind of compare how unobtrusiveness is really important if you want your applications to be maintainable. Another aspect of Aurelia is that it's really heavily relying on standards. So it's kind of a similar thing that with simplicity, but here, even if it's not the most simple thing, rather than using some framework-specific API, Aurelia wants to build its API so that it's really similar. You write similar code that you would write if you use the native API. So that again makes it easier to switch to a native API if you want to at some point get rid of Aurelia. And they actually said in their Aurelia documentation that the goal is to not need Aurelia and also not need your application to change when you take Aurelia away. But of course, Aurelia's goal is also then to improve so that the next thing that the browsers don't yet support will be supported by Aurelia. So what you will be learning is how to build web applications, how the web works and the web architecture. And you're not investing in learning this specific framework, which might or might not be there after a couple of years. And the code is also understandable for non-Aurelia developers because it's based on the standards that are wider understood, and organizations like the World Wide Web Consortium, you know what I mean. Yeah, so there are standard organizations that build these standards so that browsers will be able to build their APIs, but it's also useful to know them as a developer so that you know what you're using, and they're definitely going to be around longer than a specific framework. And when you're learning Aurelia, you're learning things like ECMAScript. So Modern JavaScript like classes and async await and decorators, those are quite heavily used by Aurelia, but that means that it doesn't have its own thing that makes this work, but it's using these standards so that when you move on to something else or when you want to learn something else, you already have a lot of knowledge that's applicable outside Aurelia as well. TypeScript, especially if you like Visual Studio Code, offers a lot of help and helps you to reduce common bugs. So when you're using Aurelia, the typings that the framework offers makes it easier to build more stable applications, less bugs, and more checking when you compile your code. And all the Aurelia decorators and APIs support TypeScript so that instead of having the conventions that might be specific to something, you have your TypeScript typings. So if you're using TypeScript, Aurelia is really helping you a lot with the development. Web Component Standard is, like I mentioned, one thing that Aurelia uses a lot. Templates, all the components use the standard template syntax, and custom elements are supported by Aurelia, and they follow the standard conventions. And you can also use Shadow DOM, part of the Web Component Standard, to display content within your components. And all those things makes your application code look like standard code instead of your framework code. And time spent Aurelia is really useful for any front-end development, so independent of the framework. So because of these things, it's really useful to learn Aurelia, not because you learn Aurelia, but because you learn all the things that you need for Aurelia, but also need for basically anything if you want to be really good at web development. So talking about the standards, I took an example of Angular. So I'm spending a couple of minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes here. I might understand things that this is doing, but it's definitely not valid HTML, and it's quite difficult to understand. There's a lot of different syntaxes that don't really comply with standards. So if you want to learn this, okay, you know how Angular templates work, but then you use React, and this is really useless for you. So I'm not saying that this is a bad syntax, but it's really specific for Angular. And comparing to Aurelia, I'll show you that later again. The idea is really that you don't need to learn these specific syntaxes, but wherever it can, it uses the standards. Some of the powerful features of Aurelia dependency injection. So this shows simplicity. There's a decorator auto-inject that lets you specify a TypeScript command. That means that in your constructor of your service component, custom attribute, anything, you can get dependency injection work just by that code. So you don't really need to do anything else than that for your dependency injection. So it's really useful in a lot of cases. So dependency injection, you have all the frameworks probably have some kind of dependency injection, but it's really simple and powerful in Aurelia. You can customize what kind of containers, what kind of component you have in the container. So you can have singletons or transient components that you inject. You can manually register your components into the container, or you can just customize the whole thing that happens behind the dependency injection. But in its simplest form, it's just that you need. So being powerful, it's really dangerous easily, so you need to keep in mind that it doesn't really solve your dependency problems. You can end up with horrible code and dependencies all over the place with dependency injection. But Aurelia's idea is to give you the freedom and give the developer the option to build the architecture the way they want. Data binding is probably one of the more controversial, especially the two-way data binding. So with Aurelia, there's an option to use one-way or two-way data binding, and again, it gives the developer the power to use this. But if you want to use more reactive style, you just want to have your component bindings work from parent to the child and not the other way around, you can do that in Aurelia as well. So it doesn't force you to use one or the other. And with data binding, the simple type of data binding is just string interpolation. So in your templates, you specify, again, using JavaScript string interpolation standard form. You specify which property you want to show there, and Aurelia creates your binding based on that. Or you can bind any attribute. So I'll be showing this later in the code, probably makes it easier to understand. Computer properties are also used with the data binding so that you don't have to have everything you bind as a field, but you can use some kind of logic behind the scenes to calculate that property. And Aurelia also, with some help, can optimize how those calculations are run. Expression syntax is probably better to just show you the syntax later. So if it gets to the next part, I'll show how you can actually get started with Aurelia. So if you have just like 1 minute time, this is probably the best place to start. I'll try to switch to show my screen. Yeah. Okay. So I'll go to the Aurelia homepage. One more try. If it doesn't work, I'll give up. Okay. So the Aurelia homepage, there's just a simple tool you can use to try Aurelia. So it's really simple to just try how it works, play around. There are 3 different components here that you can use, each of them a bit more complex than the other. There's a whole, of course, to-do application written here. So that's all the code you need for that. And you can customize the code, play around, see what happens. So that's really easy way to get started. Next thing is the Aurelia CLI. So I can show how to start up the application using CLI. So this is probably the most common way of starting up your own project. So Angular, React, Vue all have their CLIs. So with Aurelia, you have AU, which is the client. I can just call AU new. So that will give me options what kind of applications I want to create. So if I go to custom one, I can select the loader I want. I can select what kind of server I'm running on. I can use .NET Core, TypeScript, or Babel. There are a lot of options here. So you can just customize what setup works the best for you. And once you're done, Set up Visual Studio. Navigation up. No tests. So now I'm going to select that it's going to install dependencies with npm, hopefully. So the .NET Core, what that does is it will run a .NET Core application, and the Aurelia page will be served by that .NET Core server. And it will create a necessary Webpack configuration so that you can use things like hot module replacement with your .NET Core.
Is it using Webpack dev server?
Yeah. So that's what it's using in the background, and the ASP.NET Webpack package, npm package as well to start up the Webpack server. Sorry, I think that's used for the hot module replacement. Yeah. And the VS Code setting just says that it will create a VS Code folder with some like suggestions for the extensions for VS Code. And the navigation app that I selected is that just a bit more complete example. So there's a Hello World app, which is just nothing Hello World on your page. And the navigation app is a bit more, what do you say? Oh yeah, so I actually need to go where my application is. Yeah. And I selected .NET Core, so I can actually .NET run this one. Or not. I won't be installing a new SDK, so I can use .NET Core, or I can just directly start up the application with the Aurelia CLI. So go to localhost 5000, and there's my application. Okay, so the next option, so CLI is, I would say it's the best option for starting up your application unless you're really confident configuring whatever you build tools you want to use, your Webpack or Babel, anything. It takes quite a lot of effort, and you need to keep up with the changes in Webpack and everything. So CLI, I would think that's the recommended choice for starting up your application.
Does the CLI have a web management page? Because I know Vue.js has something almost like a GUI for like installing dependencies and things like that. Is there something similar for?
So I mean like more actual content that you might want to use instead of just examples, or?
No, it's more like a management page.
A management for the
Yeah, so
application.
You can run builds, you can compile it, you can
All right.
add in new packages and stuff.
Yeah,
like that.
I don't think this one has. So the Aurelia CLI is what you use for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the application that it creates is just the actual application. It doesn't do any of the build configuration.
Okay. The Vue.js UI is basically just a wrapper of like some of the npm commands.
Mm.
So you can use that to find and install particular things. Just
Yeah.
using this GUI or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can use it to start and stop the server and that sort of thing.
So yeah, just wrap around the CLI. Yeah, I don't think Aurelia has anything like that, but I would imagine it's too much work. So it's just about them knowing that it's useful. So
No, I think with Vue I looked at it once and then never.
yeah.
I don't think I've ever used it really other than go, that's pretty.
Yeah. Okay, another option. You're going to see my notes here. That's fine. Aurelia script. So this is a bit newer option. So what you do here, if I jump to my example for Aurelia script. So this is my Aurelia page here. So it's just one index page. I'm including the Aurelia script package, and then just call Aurelia use. So this is similar to what you would use if you have all the build tools in the background, but in this case you just need to import one script file. You call Aurelia start, and here I have the content of the application, actually just in line with the code, with the page. So this is my dynamic content here. So what I can do for this one is just go to the page, open the page in browser. So this is from my file system, and this is running Aurelia without any of the build tools that usually take a long time to get set up. It's really easy option to also get started with something, and it might be viable in some cases to actually use in production. It depends. It's easy to download the script file if you want. So it really depends if you need your build tools for something else as well, because if you need your TypeScript building and Webpack bundling anyway, then it might make sense to have Aurelia from that as well. But if you don't need that, it's really good option for something like just a small Aurelia component that you include in some other page instead of just like full application. So Aurelia script, that's a nice option. There are skeleton applications that are in the official Aurelia repository. So there are a lot of different options, but of course there's just a limited set. So if your setup doesn't match with one of these, you need to configure that yourself. So it's good reference if you want to know how these different setups are configured, but it gets complicated quite easily. And you have the limited choices for the toolings. So yeah, if you don't use the specific setup, then you need to know how to configure anyway. So I would use this as a reference for your own configuration instead, which is what I've done. So I have my ASP.NET Core Aurelia Webpack skeleton application that I've used with a couple of my projects. So it's really easy to get started, and it's built for Visual Studio. So you can just open it up in Visual Studio, hit F5, and that works. You have the hot module replacement Webpack running in the background. You can publish from Visual Studio without any extra configuration. You don't need to run anything from your command line. Yeah, but then I noticed 10 days ago that Microsoft decided that they don't want to support running custom JavaScript on their .NET Core servers. So you can do that until .NET 5, but after that, Microsoft is not going to support it officially. It's probably going to be a community efforts to keep the node services and spa services packages for .NET Core running. But if you're actually relying on those namespaces, then you need to do something. And what Aurelia is doing, they're building new .NET tooling. So this is not depending on the deprecated tools, but it's a new template that you can use with Aurelia. There's 4 versions planned just now, just basic or MVC integration for your existing application, and then template with like full authentication built with Aurelia and server-side rendering and that kind of thing. So it's really promising. There's a VS Code plugin that is going to work with that, and they have plans to support scaffolding with your API. So you have your API specified in your .NET Core application. The Aurelia.NET tooling can generate your client models and the API calls from that. So that sounds nice, but it's not there yet. Hopefully, it's going to be there soon. Documentation, yeah, you want to check that out if you're building an application with Aurelia. It's really nice way to getting started. There's good guides for specific, like building a component using some specific libraries, Aurelia components. But I think the API reference is something that isn't that good. So some of the other frameworks have better references. Probably one reason being that you don't really use those APIs that much. So next thing, showing some more complete examples. So I'm building a component with just a view model and a model. So Aurelia supports, I think it's mostly using MVVM, where you have your view model and your view defined in a TypeScript and HTML file. And then you have your model coming from somewhere else, normally just TypeScript calling an API. So I'll show how to communicate with bindings and events. So components in Aurelia, they have a life cycle. I think a lot of frameworks have like hooks that you use for this. So in Aurelia, you create, bind, attach your component, and then you detach and unbind, and that's a life cycle you can hook onto. And you can make your API calls and customize your DOM and do anything you want on those lifecycle hooks. So the custom component I have is here. If I show the HTML template first, so if you look at this, it doesn't really say Aurelia. There's some things like repeat for, which you might not know what it does, although it's quite obvious, like not the syntax necessarily, but the meaning. It's using attributes in a normal way without any symbols, so it works nicely within a HTML file, independent of where you open that file.
So
This, yep.
Does that repeat for an Aurelia?
Yes, so this is Aurelia custom attribute, one of the built-in ones. And you can build your own custom attributes, and you get a reference to your host element, and then the content that is within your attribute. The bind here is actually the whole model bind is another custom attribute that specifies what kind of content you get when you select that option within your select element. This is just a string interpolation, so the syntax is similar to the JavaScript string interpolation standard. Yeah, that's about it. So this is all you need for building a simple component. So some dynamic actions behind the component is done in the view model. So this is a TypeScript class. Again, there's not really specifically Aurelia things here, syntax-wise. So the bindable is a JavaScript decorator that you can define to communicate bindings to your parent component. So you can bind values, and here's the definition of the binding type. So one-time binding is really to optimize performance. It only happens one time and doesn't generate any observers, and the background from view is your binding from view to your view model. there's from to view is the one-way binding to the other way, and there's two-way binding as well, which is of course if you want to bind values for like input elements where you change the value both way. How you use this component is here. You define my component, and the name property that I defined as a bindable, I can bind that to the name. So there's two bindings. The syntax, this is one of the gotchas because of the HTML syntax not making any difference between casing. Instead of using the exactly same name as the property, which would be this, and it doesn't even like it, you use dash in between the chains of case. So I can run this. Same way. So it's going to start an application in the background. So I'm going to show this code on the left and the application on the right. So the component one. So what I have here, if you look at the component code, I have just an alert when it gets attached to DOM and when it gets bound. So the bind happens first, then the attached happens, and then you get your component. This one is here outside the component. So this is something I bind. And this value gets from the parent into the component. And this is the other way around. I get the value out of the component into my parent. So this way, this is the other way of binding that isn't supported by some of the frameworks, especially like React, which is strictly just one way. Aurelia really gives the developer more options to do, and I think it makes it simpler to do some things. But of course, you don't want to overuse it. So that's your simple component code. I can show that later in more detail if you want. Another example that I have is events. So I'm going to show first just standard DOM events. So what you can do with those is closing these. I have a calculator component. This is again just an Aurelia component. The click.delegate delegate and triggers are how Aurelia attaches your functions into standard DOM events. So the click event, this is just standard DOM without the on first. So if you'd have just a normal attribute, it would be on click and then some JavaScript. With Aurelia, you just use click.delegate. So what that does is when that DOM event happens, it calls your function. So in my case, I have this onCheck event. And it'll check your answer to a question, and it will then create a custom event. So with Aurelia, I can use standard DOM events in an identical way as you use custom events. So the click event here on the calculator, it's just click.delegate. So that's run on the click event. And then I show how this is used in the parent. So this is where I use my calculator. So the answer, that's my custom event. And I just call answer.delegate. So in the same way as I'm using standard DOM events, I can handle any custom events that I want to use. So if you want to build more reactive style applications, this is probably a really good way to start because it's standard. And again, if you move from Aurelia to something else, there's not much to change. If it supports custom events, then it will work. I'll show how that works. So back to home and my DOM event. So I have something here. I'm gonna give a wrong answer. So this is happening inside the parent. So the alert is triggered when you get the answer event. And then when I'm done, this is again caught by the parent application, parent component. Okay. Another type of event is like publish subscribe style, which are more global events that you might use for something like if you have a language selector in your application, you really want to react to that all over the place and you don't want to have some one place that everything is depending on. You just need to have some way of globally telling that this event happened. And for Aurelia, you can use event aggregator for that. So for the pub sub events, event aggregator can be just injected into your page, your component. You call subscribe. So this is called in your component where you need to know when the event happens. And you just simply have a function that is called on that event. Then publish into event is just as simple as publish and the name of the event. So I like to use constant strings for the event names so that TypeScript can check that I'm using strings that have actually been defined somewhere.
Can you change the payload of that event as well?
Yes, I can. So it's yeah. So same thing with a custom events. You can have the payload in the so it answer. Sorry, one component in the calculator. In my answer, I have a detail. This is a standard way of passing on custom event data for the publish subscribe style. You can pass the data when you subscribe, when you publish the event, and then you can use that in your subscribe. And you want to dispose of your subscriptions when you don't need them anymore to just get rid of any memory leaks. One nice thing is that you can use this kind of signals for your value converters as well. So actually showing that next. So something that you might be familiar with if you build applications using XAML. So value converters. Yeah, I think you can understand that. So in XAML, you just define a binding with a value converter from some static resource or some other resource. With Aurelia, the idea is really similar. Syntax is a bit different, but you define your value converter like this. So in XAML, you have your value converter implement an interface, and you have a convert back functions. In Aurelia, you don't have an interface, but you can specify a class that implements to view and from view, or you don't need to implement those. You can implement just one of them. And you can also pass parameters to your value converters. But what's different? So you see the XAML style, you have convert and convert back. If you don't know what those mean, you might not know the direction compared to Aurelia's to view and from view. It's quite explicit which is the direction of that binding. And also Aurelia value converter parameters can be data bound. So you can get your parameter value from somewhere else. And you can have multiple value converters combined by using multiple pipes, which are hidden there. But basically, you just have another pipe somewhere. Yeah, you can imagine. Here another pipe, and then another value converter. And it just works as you'd expect. First goes through the first value converter, and the result will go to the second value converter, and the end result will be the value of your binding. And the other way around when you're going from view to your view model. Okay, I think that starts time to wrap up. So. Why to learn Aurelia? I think it's really useful if you're learning anything to do with the front-end development. You can't really learn Aurelia without learning modern JavaScript, HTML, standards, about web components, web standards. So it's going to be really useful. And also, it's when you're learning Aurelia, it gives you enough freedom so that you need to concentrate on your own application. So it's not that much that you have Aurelia knowledge when you learn that. You actually have a lot of knowledge how to build complex web applications. So it gives you a lot of freedom, but it means that when you're learning it, you actually learn the things you need for web and also other types of application development. It's going to be useful in the future. And why you would use Aurelia in a more wider context for your production applications, the simplicity. Really, default conventions make it really simple to start the development from the application instead of just starting from the framework configuration. And the standards make it easier to learn. So it's going to be really useful for applications to be able to use the standards and have more like stable code base. And less framework code also makes it more stable. You don't need to change the code that often because there's not much framework code in your application. And there's also the plugin architecture I didn't talk about too much here that makes Aurelia more stable. So anything that needs the flexibility is separated out into a separate plugin. For example, the event aggregator that I mentioned is a separate plugin that if you don't need it, you don't use it, so you don't need to keep up with changes to that kind of extra parts. And it's really powerful, so there are features that you can misuse, but you can also use them to make the development much more efficient. And there's a comprehensive set of advanced features in Aurelia that makes the application development really nice, and you can build applications that are complex and make your own decisions of the architecture. And I think that's it. There's some links. Aurelia website has a lot of other links as well. One of the best Aurelia and front-end blogs that I've been following is the Dwayne Charrington's I Like Kill Nerds. So there's a lot of good content in there. Link to TypeScript, you might know what it is, but really useful to learn, and a really nice website to learn ES6. So that's not the latest standard, but there are probably things that you don't know there. There are things that I don't know there. So it's really a nice website that shows easily understandable format how you can improve your JavaScript code. So with Aurelia, that's really what you want to do. You want to use the best modern JavaScript style that you can, or TypeScript. But I think that's what I have here. So if you have any questions, go ahead.
Are you using any component frameworks? Whether or DevExpress or
Like UI components.
yeah.
There are some like libraries or bridges that I call to make, for example, Kendo components working in Aurelia. But like a lot of frameworks, except for React and Angular, I found out that the component vendors don't want to support the smaller frameworks. But the thing with Aurelia is that the bridge is really simple. One thing that makes Aurelia nice for like component vendors is that it gives you direct access to the DOM, so it doesn't restrict you. So if you're using something like virtual DOM, the framework can't really give access to that for the third-party vendors. So with Aurelia, the bridge that you need for the component library to work in Aurelia is so simple that it's normally not worth, like, just basically what you would do is just have bindings for all the properties that you can define in the component. But then if that changes, they need to do that, update the bridge. So I found that a lot of libraries and component libraries, it's quite easy to just use them if they have like standard JavaScript version of the library. We've used a couple of others at Codify as well. So Kendo is one. We've tried Syncfusion, and of course a lot of smaller components, just single components, data pickers and that kind of things. But I think the Syncfusion and Kendo ones are the bigger libraries that comes to mind.
And do you have any issues with that?
Some issues, yeah. I think the issues are mostly with like the build tools. So that goes to the npm configuration thingies. So yeah, once you get that JavaScript imported into your application, having that work with Aurelia or anything else, it's usually not that difficult.
In terms of like browser support, so does it use web components under the hood, or?
It uses web components when it can, so I don't know specifically which ones it does and which ones it doesn't use, but it uses browser features when it can, and it has polyfills down to IE10, I think. Depending on some of the plugins only work with IE11 or something like that, but I think the core is probably IE10. But yeah, when it can, it does use the browser features.
I assume it can be used out with .NET Core projects, yeah?
Yes, so the couple of examples I had there, actually the one where I had my example page running is this I show the configuration. Yeah, so you can probably see from the file list, it doesn't really have anything to do with .NET Core here. So the Webpack configuration, is basically what it uses as a development server, and then you just put the files on the server when you want to run it in production. And for the .NET Core version, for example, the custom skeleton I'm using, so this one has a dependency to yeah, okay. I'm not going to start going through Webpack configuration here. I promise not to. But basically, the .NET Core version of Aurelia skeleton uses some of the .NET Core libraries to like kind of allow you to use .NET Core Server.
That's really in development, isn't it?
The .NET Core version does work with the older kind of currently working like this. I can actually show that in this one. So this is the culprit for the change that Microsoft did 10 days ago. But use Webpack dev middleware. This is what you can use at the moment.
Yeah, so the .NETness here is essentially when you're in development, you'll essentially have two web servers running. One of them will be a .NET one, and then the NPM web server will be running in the background, and it essentially just proxies calls through.
Oh, okay.
So the fact that we're using .NET here is really just as a convenience, and because presumably that's where who essentially hosts their API. So you could just like most of them, I think, just use the native tools or even static files, because Webpack and all the magic will just, when you publish it, will spit out static files.
I think the nice thing with the .NET Core version is that you can use it in Visual Studio, and you don't need to start command line to have. Yeah, I think that's a nice thing. But otherwise, I'm happy to use CLI, so I probably would use that whatever I'm doing.
Aurelia scripts, was that really created as an answer to Vue, do you think? So that you can just very easily create a small island of Aurelia in a page if you want?
I think they did like follow that conversation when they started to think about the Aurelia script, and it is relatively new, but it's not like brand new. There's a repository for that. Aurelia script.
So is there any web development stuff in this one? Yeah. Is it kind of tools that I'll understand Aurelia, but is it reusing Angular or something else, or?
I'm using Knockout, which is not great. It's probably the oldest one I know. There's a big phobia of moving out to Florida, so just got to live with it, unfortunately.
It's the same, change company.
That was built by the guy who created Blazor. Same guy, Steve Sanderson, I think. He was behind Knockout originally.
At the time that Knockout was just totally different in the web world. It was nothing really much like it was. It was the first this magic binding.
I believe the Azure portal is still Knockout. So the biggest Knockout example. It's really code base.
I'm just going to stop.
What is the vNext